All right, happy Tuesday. It's time for chapter 7 of Among the Hidden. And when we left off yesterday, Luke's family is starting to somewhat be bullied by the government. They made them sell the hogs. They're starting to take away part of their land for all these new fancy houses they're building. And it's to the point where mom is having to go find a job. And of course, this complicates things for Luke because he won't have anybody at home now when he has to be hidden during the day. So, chapter 7. By mid September, Luke's days had fallen into a familiar pattern. He got up at dawn just for the chance to sit on the stairs and watch the rest of his family eat breakfast. They all rushed now. Mother had to be at the factory by 7. Dad was trying to get all the machinery in working order before harvest. And Matthew and Mark were back in school. Only Luke had time to linger over his undercooked bacon and dry toast. He didn't bother asking for butter because that meant someone would have to stand up and bring it over to him, all the while pretending for the sake of the open window that they'd just forgotten something upstairs. As soon as the rest of the family had stomped out the door, Luke went back to his room and watched out the vents. First out the front to see Matthew and Mark climb into the school bus, then out the back, where the new houses were practically finished. They were mansions, as large as the Garner's house and the barn put together. They gleamed in the morning sunlight as though their walls were studded with precious jewels. For all Luke knew, maybe they were. Hordes of workmen still arrived every morning, but almost all of them worked indoors now. They headed into the house first thing, carrying rolls of carpet, stacks of drywall, cans of paint. Luke couldn't see much of them after that. He spent more time now watching a new kind of traffic, expensive looking cars driving slowly into the newly paved streets. Sometimes they piled into a driveway and went into one of the houses, usually trailing a woman who appeared to be talking nonstop. It had taken Luke a while to figure it out. He certainly hadn't dared to ask anyone in his family, but he thought maybe the people were thinking about buying the houses. Once he realized that, he studied each potential neighbor carefully. He overheard Mother and Dad marveling that the people moving into the new houses were not just going to be city people, but barons. Barons were unbelievably rich, Luke knew. They had things ordinary people hadn't had in years. Luke wasn't sure how the barons had gotten rich when everybody else was poor, but Dad never said a word, baron without a curse word or two in front of it. The people streaming through the houses did look different from anyone in Luke's family. They were mostly thin, beautiful women in form fitting dresses, and heavy set men in what Luke's dad and brothers called sissy clothes, shiny shoes, and clean, dressy pants and jackets. Luke always felt a little embarrassed for them, showing up like that. Or maybe he was embarrassed for his family that they never looked like any of the Barons. Luke preferred it when the adults had children with them and he could concentrate on them. The smallest ones were always as dressed up as their parents, with hair bows and suspenders and other gewgaws Luke knew his parents would never buy. The older kids usually seemed to be wearing whatever they grabbed first out of their closet that morning. Though he knew no one would dare show up with 3 kids, he always counted. One, two, one, one, two. What if a family with just one kid moved in behind them and he sneaked into their house and pretended to be their second child? He could go to school, go to town, act like Matthew and Mark. What a joke. Luke living with Barons. More likely he'd be shot for trespassing or turned in. When he began thinking things like that, he always jumped down from his perch by the vent and grabbed a book from one of the dusty stacks by the eaves. Mother had taught him to read and do math as much as she knew herself. At least we have a few books for you, she often mumbled sadly when she left in the morning. He read over all the books dozens of times, even the ones with titles like Diseases of the Porcine Species and Common Grasses of Our Countryside. His favorites were the handful of adventure books, the ones that let him pretend he was a knight fighting a dragon to rescue a kidnapped princess, or an explorer sailing on the high seas, holding tight to a mast while a hurricane raged about him. He liked to forget he was Luke Garner, third child, hidden in the attic. Sometimes around noon, he'd hear the door from the mud room to the kitchen swing open, and he'd go down and eat at the same time as his dad. Without Mother, there was no homemade pies now, no mashed potatoes, no roast that sent good smells throughout the house. Dad always made 4 sandwiches, checked to make sure no one could see him, then handed 2 of them to Luke in the stairwell. Dad never talked. He'd explain that he didn't want anyone overhearing him and wondering. But he did turn the radio on for the noon farm report, and there was usually a song or two after that before Dad silenced the radio and went back outside to work again. When Dad left, Luke went back to his room to read or watch the houses again. At 6:30 Mother came home, and she always stopped in and said hi to Luke before rushing out to do a whole day's work in the few hours between bedtime. Usually Matthew or Mark came up to visit him too, but they never stayed long either. They had to help Dad before supper, then do homework afterwards, and they always had been nicest to Luke outdoors. Before the woods came down, the three of them often played kickball or football or spud in the backyard after school and chores. Matthew and Mark always fought about who got to have Luke on his team, because even if Luke wasn't very good, two boys together could always beat the third. Now they play half-hearted games of cards or checkers with Luke, but Luke could tell they'd rather be outside. So would he. He tried not to think about it. The best part of the day came at the end when Mother tucked him in. She'd be relaxed then. She'd stay for an hour sometimes, asking him what he'd read that day or telling him stories about the factory. Then one night, when she was telling how her plastic glove had gotten stuck in a chicken sheet to gut it that day, Mother suddenly stopped in the middle of a sentence. Mother, Luke said. She answered with a snort. She'd fallen asleep sitting up. Luke studied her face, seeing lines of fatigue that hadn't been there before, noticing that the hair around her face now held as much gray as brown. Mother, he said again, gently shaking her arm. She jerked. But I cleaned that chicken off. Oh, sorry, Luke. You need tucking in, don't you? She fluffed his pillow, smoothed his sheet. Mother, that's okay, Luke said. I'm getting too old for this He swallowed a lump in his throat. Anyway, I bet you weren't still tucking Matthew or Mark in when they were 12. No, she said quietly. Then I don't need it either. Okay, she said. She kissed his forehead anyhow, then turned out the light. Luke turned his face to the wall until she left.